Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this evening's Rowntree Society event, sharing our research on the Caribbean plantations that were owned or leased by the Rowntree Company. I'm Nick Smith, the Executive Director of the Rowntree Society, and tonight I'm going to be joined by two of our trustees, Maureen Grant and Stephen Pittam as well. For those of you who don't know about the Rowntree Society, we're a small educational charity based here in York, and our purpose is to build and share knowledge about the Rowntree family, company and trusts, and its continuing relevance to the local, national and global challenges that face us today. Currently, we're grateful to receive our primary funding via a grant made by the three Joseph Rowntree Trusts, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Before we start, I'd like to thank our host tonight, Clements Hall, and especially Linda, their manager, who's helping me look after the technology. We're also filming the event, and thank you to Inkblot Films for their services with this. The recording is going to be uploaded on our YouTube channel, free for anyone to access. Our newsletter subscribers will be able to see it first before it goes public. So if anyone doesn't want to be on the film, let us know, especially if you ask a question as part of the Q&A later. We are filming from the back, so most of the time we're just going to get the back of your head. This evening's event is part of our ongoing Colonial Histories and Legacy project, which has been looking at researching and telling parts of the Rowntree story, which have in the past not really been widely known about. The Rowntree Company was started and expanded globally and financially within the context of the colonial project of the British Empire across a period of 150 years. And as such, this project has a broad scope with different aspects being researched and explored. For some of the previous work we've done in this project, please see our website and our YouTube channel, which has recordings of two previous events that we've ran as part of the project. Those are called From Kit Kats to Colonialism and History Unsweetened. The research being presented tonight was carried out last year by Laura Strachan, who at the time was a volunteer research assistant for the Rowntree Society. And it built on work done by our former executive director, Dr. Catherine Oakley, and was also developed further in collaboration with Fiona Grimshaw when she was our executive director. This evening, we're going to play the lecture that Laura recorded for us. And then you're going to hear from two of our trustees, Maureen and Stephen. And at the end, there'll be some time for Q&A where you can ask me, Maureen or Stephen, any questions. So we'll get on and see if we can play Laura's lecture.
Hi everyone, I'm Laura, a volunteer and research assistant here at the Rowntree Society. Today I'll be presenting on the history of estates which the Rowntree Company purchased and leased on Caribbean islands, Jamaica and Dominica in the years 1896 to 1934 to produce raw ingredients for their products. This will extend the research project of the Rowntree Company's historical global supply chains, which began at the Rowntree Society in 2020. The project has been made possible through access to the Borthwick Institute for Archives, located at the University of York, which holds the Rowntree Company archives alongside the archives of the Rowntree family and trusts. The Rowntree Company's dealings with cocoa have their origins in two grocery businesses. Joseph Rowntree Sr. began Rowntree's as a grocer's shop in the centre of York in 1822, also operating as a tea dealer and coffee roaster. After Joseph Rowntree Sr.'s death, his son Henry Isaac purchased the cocoa, chocolate, and chicory component of another York grocer's business. This was from fellow Quaker family, the Tukes, in 1862, which had dealt in products flourishing in the British Empire, such as tea, coffee, and sugar since the 1700s. In 1864, Henry Isaac oversaw the transfer of the business to a factory at the Tanner's Moat site by the River Ouse in York. The growing Rowntree business remained largely a family affair, with Henry Isaac's younger brother, Joseph Rowntree, managing the purchasing and sales of raw materials and ingredients. However, very little is known about the colonial origins of the goods the Rowntree business sold. Given that the Tukes operated at the height of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century, it is highly probable that this business bought and sold goods which were produced by enslaved African people in European colonies. Likewise, as Joseph Rowntree Sr. began the grocers in 1822, 11 years before the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act, it is also possible he may have profited from unfree black labour. When Henry Isaac Rowntree later operated the business, he is known to have purchased cocoa beans on the London and Liverpool markets, and by 1887, Rowntree's Elect Cocoa was put on the market for the first time, yet detail of its origins remain unclear. Ultimately, his eldest brother, John Wilhelm Rowntree, was the driving force behind the acquisition of cocoa estates in the West Indies after travelling to the islands in 1896 and becoming a member of the Limited Company's Board of Directors in 1897. From the early 1900s, Rowntree and Co. was purchasing many types of cocoa from various global regions such as the West Indies, West Africa, and Latin America. Rowntree acquired plantations and estates on the West Indian islands of Dominica and Jamaica in 1898 and 1899 respectively. Most of the estates were former slave plantations. These purchases were spearheaded by John Wilhelm. He argued this would allow the company to obtain its raw material at a price cheaper than quoted on the London markets, gaining a competitive advantage over their rivals. He had to make a case to his family in order to get them to agree. His father, Joseph Rowntree, was extremely skeptical of overseas exports and the risks of this venture abroad and the resources it required. John Wilhelm countered these objections by pointing out how the family's capital was precariously tied up in a single business. He feared that other chocolatier companies could gain disproportionate control over supplies, especially as British rival Cadbury's had also recently bought their own plantation in Trinidad. Thus, Rowntree and Co.'s plantations would be a safeguarding measure should a purchasing ring develop. Though his plan was initially opposed by the board, John Wilhelm stressed it was the right time to buy plantations as cocoa production was still dominated by small-scale peasant farmers and there was significant scope for investment. Moreover, with the global decline of the demand for cane sugar in the 1890s, West Indian farmers were turning to alternative crops like cocoa. This may have been an additional push factor to why Rowntree chose the West Indies specifically. John Wilhelm's interest in vanilla and lime cultivation is documented in records from the time. Again, it was John Wilhelm who was the visionary of Rowntree and Co.'s international business expansion. He was eager to not only provide affordable cocoa to the Rowntree factories in York, but to also sell Rowntree cocoa and other crops to new markets in places like the US, Canada, and Australia. The company's directors also hoped to gain further competitive advantages over other confectionery companies through development of production techniques. John Wilhelm believed the company could usefully exploit its intellectual capital, experimenting on the preparation of cocoa, such as building curing sheds or refining cocoa through the old plantation sugar mills. Though the expanding company had a large amount of capital invested in manufacturing facilities, it was dependent upon skills and business decisions of cocoa farmers and shippers. To date, there are 6 known estates acquired by the Rowntree Company in Dominica: Blenheim, Pickard, Moore Park, Hatton Hall, Mount Pleasant, and Bois Chandel in both the north and south regions of the island. When purchased, the estates had a considerable lime cultivation, with the fruit processed in the old sugar works where the mills, stills, and building pans had been adapted for limes. In Jamaica, there were 4 known Rowntree estates: the Vinery, Prior Park, Windsor Castle, and Dover Castle. As Jamaica's landscape is mostly mountainous, this created excellent conditions to also grow bananas and coconuts on the plantations. Here is a map of cultivations of Moore Park Estate in Dominica, dated to 1917 from the Borthwick Institute for Archives. The key on the left-hand side labels the areas on the estate with old and young crops. Some historical sources have indicated that the company also purchased estates in Trinidad, but our most recent research indicates that this was not the case. The Rowntree Company's annual reports from this period give detailed descriptions on staff duties on the estates. Managers were responsible for purchasing all goods, overseeing all workers and disputes, and reporting on all trade, estate, and cultivation developments. The labourers' work was often divided by sex. Men did more arduous work, such as harvesting, breaking, and fermenting the cocoa, while women usually collected, scooped, and carried cocoa. Some work, such as dancing or drying the cocoa, was done by both sexes. In addition, women had the responsibility for producing and preparing food and providing other services such as healthcare for their families and neighbours on or near the estates. The in-house magazine for the staff at Rowntree and Co, called the Cocoa Works magazine, also gave descriptions of daily life on the newly acquired plantations. However, this was largely through the lens of white managerial staff. The Cocoa Works magazine began in 1902 as a journal of the interests of employees focusing on the lives of ordinary workers. Conceived by Joseph Rowntree, he described it as a means of maintaining communication between workforce and management at a time of rapid expansion. This allowed York factory workers to be routinely updated on the opposite end of the production chain, often including descriptions of the tropical climate, crops, and farming techniques. In 1904, the Rowntree Company estimated that there were 9 white managers, 343 black labourers, and 100 East Indian labourers on all plantations owned in the West Indies. In an early 1902 issue of the Cocoa Works magazine, an article focusing on the Jamaican vinery estate gave further insight into the ethnic composition of the vinery workers and their living conditions. The vinery employed 100 men and women total, 60 black labourers and 40 East Indians. The 40 East Indian labourers lived on the estate in single-room barracks, which had an estate shop close by, selling saltfish, rice, mealies, tinned goods, and mineral water. Afro-Caribbean workers usually lived in their own cottages. This photograph from 1897, property of Rowntree and Co Limited, depicts East Indian workers on the estate of Ortanola in Trinidad in 1898, where cocoa was cultivated for the Cadbury farm. We believe the photograph was taken during a Rowntree Company visit to the Caribbean shortly before it acquired its own estates in the region. The image has the caption, "Coolies sorting cocoa." Coolie was an offensive bureaucratic term used in the British colonial system to describe indentured labourers. The presence of East Indian workers on the estate and on Rowntree estates in the Caribbean was a direct consequence of a system of indentured labour. The system of indenture involved the movement of over 1.3 million Indian labour migrants to European colonies between 1834 and 1917. Indenture was the British government's answer to labour shortages in its colonies generated by the abolition of the slave trade. The British government recruited colonised people from East India to work in its other colonial territories for a fixed period, usually between 5 and 7 years. A form of unfree labour, contracts of indenture typically restricted workers' movements and had penal clauses for breach of the contract's terms. Although the system of indenture was challenged by groups such as Anti-Slavery Society from the 1840s onwards, it was only abolished in British colonies in 1917, following mounting pressure from Indian nationalists, with some contracts remaining in place until 1920. So far, we have not been able to establish whether Rowntree and Co. used contracts of indenture on their Caribbean plantations. However, we do know that the company benefited from the labour of East Indian workers who had formerly been indentured. A report from the Vinery estate in 1908 indicated that there were no indentured labourers there, but only those who were free or time expired. Some time expired Indian workers chose to stay in the region. Others remained because the colonial government put policies and procedures in place which made it difficult for them to obtain passage back to India. West Indian culture was often documented in the Cocoa Works magazine, attempting to be captured in a humorous way. For example, here we can see a short piece titled "Cricket Where the Cocoa Grows" from 1910. On first glance, the magazine has taken a photograph of young boys on an estate playing cricket, the West Indies' most popular sport. They are also wearing a Manx shirt CC, suggesting this was a form of organised leisure. The caption underneath uses sarcasm to make the racialised joke to not mistake them for the Rowntree Juniors, the cricket team at the York factory, despite the West Indian boys, quote, looking suspiciously alike, unquote. Many of the Cocoa Works magazine anecdotal stories of the life on the islands were presented in a curious but derogatory way, typical of the time. One especially memorable edition of the Cocoa Works magazine was an article titled "The High Woods" in 1906. The article tells the story of a group camping trip climbing Morne Bayabloten, the highest mountain in Dominica. The party consisted of 6 white managerial staff, including Joseph Rowntree's nephew Frank, several cooks, bearers of the estate, and a head man, Semper, a young hunter of half Carib descent. After a long ascent, the group set up camp in an adjuba, a traditional wooden hut, Gathering round the fire during a tropical rainstorm in mud over a foot in depth, the white managerial staff listened as their Caribbean counterparts sang sacred songs and told traditional African folk tales known as Nancy stories. The Cocoa Works magazine also documented organised estate dances. At Moore Park in 1906, by the request of the labourers, the dance was in a low room at moonlight, with welcome songs, refreshments, and dance such as quadrilles and polka, which lasted throughout the night. The dances were usually to celebrate a holiday, allowing labourers to dress up and enjoy the festivities. Many articles in the Cocoa Works magazine express a racialized fascination with East Indian workers, distinguishable by their, quote, gaily colored garments and headgear, unquote, and bright colors which it associated with the East. One article stated that, quote, they have not for the most part shed their East Indian dress, handicrafts, customs, or religious observances, unquote. The magazine also discusses how labourers would put on their best clothes for the town or coastal markets on Saturdays. On the morning, they would line up in the workers' yard awaiting payment by the manager before travel. Town markets were an opportunity for the labourers to not only purchase but sell on the market. Many labourers were self-sufficient through their own plots of ground and cultivations on or near the estate, which the Cocoa Works magazine attributed to a hard-working, independent and happy worker. Here is a photograph of Rowntree Company workers on the Dover estate in Jamaica in 1900. The company leased land and buildings on the estate, a former sugar and banana slave plantation. In Jamaica, the estates were put up for sale by 1914. Rowntree and Co.'s largest Jamaican estate, the vinery, never recorded a profit. The sale of bananas, from which the greater part of the revenue of the vinery derived, had been seriously affected by lack of equipment such as steamers to carry the fruit. Moreover, the banana crops were virtually destroyed by a hurricane in the second half of 1916, halting all purchasing. The Kingston Gleaner, Jamaica's largest newspaper company on the island, reported that, quote, all properties of Hard Hill, Windsor Castle, Vinery, and Dover have been ruined. Many of the tenant houses are either totally destroyed or so badly wrecked as to render them uninhabitable, unquote. Vinery, due to being on a hill, was the most badly hit, with many having sought refuge in the factory buildings, the shop, and at a local school during the night. According to Rowntree and Co.'s West Indian Department report of this year, some cocoa was reaped, but the banana crop was unable to recover. Rather, cocoa sales were impacted by the outbreak of World War I. The British government's decision to restrict cocoa imports into the United Kingdom proved detrimental to Rowntree and Co. The Jamaican estates were the largest exporters of cocoa from the island and exported it solely to the United Kingdom. In 1918, the Jamaican Gleaner newspaper reported that, quote, the retirement of this old and well-established firm was brought about by the restrictions on the exportation of cocoa to the United Kingdom from this island, and circulates year by year a very large sum of money principally among the small settlers. By fair and upright trading, their representative has won universal popularity, and the coming retirement is regarded as a death blow to remunerative prices, unquote. The vinery was the first to go. The estate was leased in 1917 at a net rental of £400 per annum, with the option of purchasing during the 5-year period of the lease for £4,500. It was sold within the year, with Rowntree and Co.'s 1918 West Indian Department report recording a net capital of £6,686, with a £2,041 surplus from the vinery itself. According to the minutes from a meeting of the company's board dated back to December 1917, the vinery was sold to a Mr. Fouché. Business on all other estates had equally declined in this period, during which time the Jamaican purchasing business had gradually shifted to Kingston, where a buying station was retained until 1924. Consequently, with all other estate buildings and machinery in poor condition, needing extensive repairs and heavy upkeep, it was decided that all other land would be sold in conjunction to the vinery. In 1917, Rowntree and Co. sold its curing factory at Windsor Castle for £606. The buyers remain unknown. After the early death of John Wilhelm in 1905, Rowntree and Co. returned to a more cautious international approach. His brother, Wilhelm Rowntree, after he had taken his brother's place as chairman of the company in 1923, set his sights on Asia with an interest in exploring Japanese confectionery and establishing a network of agents in India and the Far East. However, he was generally more interested in the improvement of working conditions at the firm in York than in the exploitation of new markets overseas. Seemingly, out of all the Rowntree men, John Wilhelm was the first and most eager to envisage the company as a multinational operating enterprise, believing the benefit would outweigh the risk. Business historian Robert Fitzgerald has argued that the Caribbean estates were a commercial failure overall for the Rowntree business, plagued by mismanagement and were unprofitable from the outset. By 1902, the company was opposed to any further acquisitions but continued with its investment program in the estates already bought. By the outbreak of the First World War, suggested sums of £34,000 had been invested in estates despite the fact they provided Rowntree with only 1/12 of its cocoa needs. The West Indies declined in importance as cocoa producers insomuch that by 1926, the cocoa produced in Dominica was not even being used in the Rowntree factory in York. Instead, Rowntree and Co. moved its interest to cocoa on the West African region referred to as the Gold Coast, which had steadily improved its manufacturing processes and transport infrastructure. The Rowntree estates on the island of Dominica were retained for an additional 16 years until 1934, consecutively generating profit for the West Indian business. Thanks to its topography, which combined both lowlands and highlands, Dominica was fit for a wider variety of crops. Limes became the estate's biggest production over cocoa, and the company secured contracts with New Zealand buyers for large quantities of raw and concentrated lime juice and oil at unparalleled prices. Limes cultivated in Dominica were also a key ingredient in Rowntree's lime cordial. Likewise, Dominica was developing a fruit trade with Canada under government supervision, intending to carry produce fortnightly on ladyboats from the English islands. As limes accounted for 93% of the island's total exports, cocoa was largely abandoned by planters, given that global cocoa prices, except for high-grade South American cocoa, fell to record low levels in this period. Nevertheless, the successes of the limes were short-lived. Withertip and red root diseases plagued the Rowntree estates, resulting in a shortage of lime products recorded as early as 1924. Furthermore, business was disrupted by a severe hurricane in September 1928, which did extensive damage to the trees and smaller damage to the buildings. Again, another hurricane in 1930 caused further damage to the lime tree's roots, with the total yield of the crop showing a reduction in over 40% in money value by 1932. Rowntree and Co. tried experimenting with various forms of manure and spraying the trees with Bordeaux mixture in order to recover crop sales while contemplating the future of the Dominica estates. There was even noted interest in the future demand of soft drinks in England and Canada, which potentially could be why Rowntree and Co. retained Dominica's estates even after years of net profit loss. Yet, this never materialized. The sale of the Dominica estates was completed on the 23rd of April, 1934, for a total of £5,000 to Messrs. Rose and Co. Limited, a British juice and cordial company. In conclusion, this 2023 research project has enabled us to gain a broader and more comprehensive understanding of Rowntree and Co.'s Caribbean plantations across the years 1896 to 1934. We have been able to build on the early research from 2020 in identifying the motivating factors behind Rowntree and Co.'s purchase of estates in the West Indies, why they were later sold, and why Dominica was retained until 1934. Another area of relative success has been our exploration of the experiences of the plantation workers and their social and cultural histories, primarily through entries in the Cocoa Works magazine. However, given the nature of the Rowntree archives, all the material consulted has come from a white, Eurocentric perspective and from positions of power within the company. We are left with many significant questions, such as what the experiences of both Black and East Indian labourers were on the Rowntree plantations, whether these differed, and if so, how, and what the attitudes of Caribbean workers were towards Rowntree and Co. as employers. Further gaps in the research include the contractual terms of employment for Black and East Indian workers on Rowntree plantations and the company's relationship with the British system of indenture. Future research in these areas could be achieved by scoping archives in the Caribbean which hold information about indentureship and its abolition, and potentially about operations of Rowntree estates. Oral history with descendants of Jamaican and Dominican workers who were employed on Rowntree plantations might also be a fruitful line of inquiry. Another potential lead would be to investigate the other cocoa supply chains, given that at its peak, Rowntree and Co.'s West Indian plantations only supplied the York factory with 12% of its cocoa needs. Overall, by undertaking this type of research, we are starting to redress the balance of the Rowntree Company's history and public perception as a white, local, and conservatively British story of chocolate, reconnecting it to its lesser-known environments and histories in cocoa production, colonialism, and race. This presentation is just the beginning.
Thank you to Laura in her absence for that talk. We're next going to hear from Maureen Grant, one of our trustees.
Right, good evening, and as Nick said, my name is Maureen Grant, and I'm a trustee for the Joseph Rowntree Society. As we've heard, indentureship was a labor system introduced by colonial powers after the abolition of slavery, bringing primarily Indian, Chinese, and other Asian people to work on plantations, especially in the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia. These indentured workers were subject to harsh conditions, and their experiences left lasting social, economic, and cultural impacts on post-colonial societies and their people. In the limited time I have available, I will trace how the power dynamics within the system of indentureship and post-colonialism remains largely intact on a global scale. I will also show how this power imbalance is manifested and experienced in today's communities, particularly in the UK. The power imbalance between developed and developing countries is sustained through a combination of historical, economic, and political and institutional factors. These are some of the key mechanisms that maintain this imbalance. So colonialism set up extractive economies. So in many developing countries, focusing on resource export and leaving limited infrastructure for self-sustained growth. These post-colonial power structures often preserve the economic and political systems left by colonizers. And since raw materials typically have lower profit margins than finished goods, this relationship often favors developed economies. And developing nations often rely on loans from international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. High interest rates and strict loan conditions can lead to debt cycles where countries struggle to even repay the interest. Also, conditions tied to these loans frequently require austerity measures and market policies that limit governments' ability to invest in development and social programs for their own citizens. Foreign aid, while sometimes helpful, can also reinforce dependence, as it is often tied to specific conditions that align with donor countries' interests, rather than allowing recipient countries to independently pursue their own developmental agendas. And then there's multinational corporations from developed countries, often operate in developing countries, as we know from our current experience, where they extract resources and repatriate profits. These corporations can wield significant influence over local governments and may lobby for favorable regulations, often in ways that disadvantage local economies. Resource-rich developing countries are sometimes locked into extractive economies where they are economically dependent on a few exports. This limits diversification and subjects them to global price fluctuations, increasing vulnerability. And developed countries often maintain tariffs, subsidies, and other trade barriers that make it difficult for developing countries to compete in international markets. Then there's the issue of intellectual property laws, which often restrict access to technology and medications for developing countries, driving up costs and slowing technological advancement. For example, patents on medications can make essential drugs unaffordable, and low-income populations for low-income populations, and a lack of access to technology limits developing countries' abilities to innovate, compete in high-tech industries, and achieve self-sustaining development. And developed countries tend to wield disproportionate influence in international institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, IMF, and the World Trade Organizations. Decisions in these institutions often reflect the interests of powerful economies, which can disadvantage developing nations. Educational disparities contribute to long-term imbalances. Many skilled professionals from developing countries emigrate to developed countries for better opportunities, creating a brain drain. This loss of talent reduces the pool of human capital necessary for economic growth and innovation for developing countries. And many developing countries are more vulnerable to climate change impacts, but lack resources for mitigation and adaptation. This vulnerability can hinder economic progress and increase dependence on international aid. Media outlets from developed countries dominate global narratives, often framing issues and policies from the perspective of wealthier nations. This influences public perception, foreign policy, and even domestic policies in developing countries. And these mechanisms are intertwined and often reinforce one another, creating self-perpetuating cycle of dependence. Efforts to address these imbalances, such as debt relief, fair trade agreements, technology transfer, and climate finance, are essential but challenging due to the deeply rooted power structures that benefit wealthier nations. So how does this power paradigm affect the people concerned? In modern post-colonial society, income inequality, lack of access to economic opportunities, and poverty remain prevalent issues. Additionally, many ex-colonies continue to rely heavily on primary industries like agriculture, without significant development of higher wage sectors, leading to high levels of unemployment and economic vulnerability. So there is a general lack of infrastructure to promote long-term growth and resilience, and the cycle continues. The result is intensified racial division. Indentureship intensified racial and ethnic stratification, as colonial authorities often encouraged divisions between different labor groups to maintain control. For example, African-descended enslaved people and Indian and indentured workers. These racial divisions and stereotypes have persisted, often creating social tensions between ethnic communities. In countries like Trinidad and Guyana, for example, political parties sometimes align with specific ethnic groups, reinforcing divisions that trace back to indentureship and slavery eras. This ethnic division can hinder social cohesion, political unity, and equitable development. In the UK, the culture of them and us is further perpetuated by immigration policies from 1962 designed to promote division and exclusion along racial lines. Descendants of indentured workers and enslaved people continue to negotiate questions of cultural identity, balancing preservation of heritage with national identity. Under indentureship, laborers were typically not given land rights and had limited means to accumulate wealth. In the post-colonial era, issues of land ownership and economic displacement persist. Indigenous populations, descendants of indentured laborers, and other marginalized groups often lack land ownership, leading to ongoing economic insecurity. Land reform remains a sensitive issue, particularly in some parts of post-colonial Africa, as governments seek to address historical inequities while balancing contemporary economic pressures. Indentureship was one of the earliest large-scale migration of workers across the continent, setting up substantial diaspora communities in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Today, these diaspora communities maintain connections to their heritage while often experiencing complex dynamics in their new homelands. Migration patterns continue to be influenced by the economic challenges of post-colonial societies, as descendants of indentured and enslaved populations often seek better opportunities abroad. This can impact family structures, social cohesion, and economic stability within their home countries. Education for indentured laborers was minimal, often focusing only on skills needed for plantation work with limited opportunities for advancement. The educational infrastructure in post-colonial societies is often under-resourced, with disparities in access to quality education based on socio-economic status. This has resulted in generational educational inequality, limiting the economic mobility of marginalized communities and perpetuating social stratification. The overwhelming outcome is a culture of them and us, which breeds distrust and lack of understanding, hostility, disrespect, insensitivity, and indifference. The result is deep-seated prejudice, discriminatory behavior, and racial bias in almost all of our institutions, including education, employment, health, and criminal justice. The psychological impact of racism affects both Black and white communities, although in different ways. The psychological impact on Black communities could include trauma and chronic stress, internalized racism leading to self-doubt, low self-esteem, or even self-hatred. This can be particularly detrimental in shaping self-identity, especially in young people. And although racism can create trauma, it also fosters resilience within Black communities. Cultural pride, community support, and collective identity all offer crucial protective factors that help buffer against some of the negative effects of discrimination. Shared experiences can foster solidarity, strengthen mental resilience. In white communities, there might be feelings of confusion, helplessness, and frustration, especially from witnessing or indirectly participating in unjust structures. Many white individuals grapple with reconciling their own beliefs with the reality of systemic racism. This struggle can be especially significant for those who value equality but recognize the privilege inherent in their racial identity, creating an internal conflict around privilege and fairness. Some research suggests that discomfort in discussing race can lead to white fragility, where feelings of defensiveness or anger emerge as a way to protect oneself from confronting uncomfortable truths. This reaction may prevent people from engaging in meaningful dialogue, limiting growth and understanding. On a positive note, exposure to racial issues can also inspire empathy and a desire to advocate for change. Many white individuals who engage in anti-racist work report a sense of purpose and community connection. White individuals raised within a racially stratified society often internalize biases, even unconsciously. Recognizing and unlearning these biases can be psychologically taxing, but it is crucial for personal growth and fostering healthier interracial interactions. So, what are the interpersonal and societal effects? The psychological impact of racism can make interracial friendships and relationships more challenging, as individuals may carry biases, fears, or distrust. While these relationships can offer valuable perspectives and support, they often require significant empathy and patience to navigate difference in racial experience. Racism contributes to social and political divides, which can lead to heightened feelings of anxiety and anger in both communities. News coverage and social media often exacerbate this tension, creating a sense of collective unease that can impact mental health on a large scale. And both communities can feel disempowered by the persistence of racism. Black communities may feel powerless in a system that disadvantaged them, while white communities may feel unsure of how to create change. This helplessness can be paralyzing and deter people from working together, working towards solutions, impacting motivation and mental well-being. In conclusion, the transition from indentureship to the present day to post-colonial societies reflects an ongoing struggle with issues that trace back to colonial exploitation and labor systems. Today, challenges like economic inequality, racial tensions, cultural identity, migration, and political instability remain as legacies of indentureship and colonialism. Efforts to address these issues often require a nuanced understanding of history and a commitment to policies that promote social justice, equitable development, and inclusive governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Maureen. Stephen, do you want me to come over there, or where do you want to go?
I don't mind.
You can go here. I need to clip this one onto you.
Yeah, sure. Great, okay. Well, I hope we can all hold on to what Maureen has just talked to us, because I'm going to take us back a bit into the Rowntree and the West Indian plantations. But I think the message that Maureen's giving us is really important, and one that maybe we can think about as we think about the story about the Rowntree and their involvement in plantations. Like Maureen, I'm a trustee of the Rowntree Society, and also like Maureen, I spent much of my working life working with the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which is one of the 3 trusts which Joseph endowed in 1904. I really want to give credit to Kat Oakley and to Laura, who's made this presentation today, for kind of opening up a discussion on something that, for 26 years, whilst I was at the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, I was never aware of. I might have been slightly aware of them because, of course, I had read a lot about Rowntree and the Rowntree family. But even today, I've just looked at Anne Vernon's book on Joseph Rowntree, a Quaker businessman, and I cannot find any reference to plantations in the West Indies. It may be there, but I can't find any record of it. And I think that's quite amazing, to think that I could be 26 years working in an organisation, working on the issue of racial justice as well. Both Maureen and I were engaged in work on racial justice, and the issue of the colonial background of the Rowntree Company never really raised its head. And I think, obviously, it's since the Black Lives Matter that we've really started thinking about this and thinking that we need to know more about a different side of the Rowntree history. So, because it seems to me, I've been very interested in Catherine Hall's work on the whole question of the ending of the slave trade and what happened and all of that. And she talks about issues being hidden in full sight. And I think this is a really interesting example of an issue which has been hidden in full sight. It is in full sight, it's there, all the information's there. I mean, Laura found a lot of information in the Cocoa Works magazine, and it's not as if it's been hidden, and yet it is hidden. It's hidden to us in some ways. And so in the context of thinking about issues hidden in full sight, and the contradictions that we live with, and I think the contradictions which, to many extent, the members of the Rowntree family lived with during this period. Sorry, am I causing all sorts of problems? No? Are we all right? Yeah. I just wanted to think a little bit about one of the key players in the story that we heard from Laura, and his role in all of this. And that is John Wilhelm Rowntree. And part of the reason that I was wanting to talk about John Wilhelm Rowntree a bit is that actually in the Rowntree Society we haven't talked much about John Wilhelm Rowntree. He's not been a figure that we have given a lot of attention to. And the reason I want to talk about John Wilhelm Rowntree was that I think you probably remember from Laura's presentation that in a way he was the key figure in the drive for the plantations in the West Indies. John Wilhelm Rowntree was the eldest son of Joseph Rowntree and his second wife, Emma Seabohm. And he was born in 1868. And from all accounts, despite suffering from illnesses from an early age, he had a lively mind, wide interests, and an outgoing, friendly, and humorous personality. In fact, he was said to be one of the few people who could make Joseph Rowntree laugh, which probably says quite a lot about him. But he didn't succeed very well at school. He was at Bootham School, but he didn't shine particularly academically, and that was partly because of some of his disabilities. He had a hearing problem and an eyesight problem, and later he obviously became ill and died very young. He joined the family firm in 1886 when he was aged 18, taking part in the manual labour of every department before he moved into management. And the interesting thing, at that time, when he joined the firm in 1886, there were just 200 employees. So it wasn't such a big company in those days, obviously. And he probably got to know nearly everybody who was working there. So, as Laura mentioned, it was in 1896, so that's what, 10 years perhaps after he joined the company, he travelled to Trinidad to visit the estates that had recently been acquired by the Cadbury Company. And I think the rivalry here between Cadbury and Rowntree is interesting. They were in many ways quite friendly with each other, but they were also big rivals. And Deborah Cadbury, in her book Chocolate Wars, tells us that William Cadbury, who was the chief buyer for the Cadbury Company, had bought 2 small estates in Trinidad in the 1890s to research improvements in methods of cocoa cultivation. Now, this clearly influenced John Wilhelm. As we've heard in Laura's talk, he returned from this trip, and within a year, he was arguing that for the purchase of plantations in the West Indies. And he talked, as we've heard, that the estates would enable the company to obtain its raw materials at a cheaper price than buying on the market, the London and Liverpool markets. Other chocolate companies may gain disproportionate control over supplies. I think he was really worried. He saw that Cadbury's had got these plantations in Trinidad, and he was quite worried that there could be a restrictive practices which would lead to the Rowntree Company not being able to get its supplies. And he was also, rather like William Cadbury, keen on the development of production techniques. Now, I don't know if you noticed one of the lines that Nick had used on the advert for this talk was a quotation which came from John Wilhelm Rowntree, saying, and you know, what do we think about this statement today? Our idea is to bring English energy and scientific knowledge to bear on tropical cultures. And Cat Oakley, our previous executive director, found that in a letter that John Wilhelm Rowntree had written to the Foreign Office. It's in the National Archive at the time that they were thinking of purchasing these plantations. And he was also interested in internationalizing the Rowntree business, both in terms of providing the supply of raw materials to the York factory, but also, as I think Laura talked about, in terms of selling Rowntree cocoa internationally. He was thinking about how to internationalize the business. Now, I said that he argued, in which he did argue, and it was only a year after he'd come back from Trinidad, and it was only 2 years after he'd become a director of the company. But he was arguing his case at the board, and he had to argue his case at the board because his father, Joseph Rowntree, was extremely sceptical, and I think that came out also in what Laura was saying. Joseph Rowntree thought that it was very risky and resource intensive. And I also wonder if Joseph's opposition to this, or his concern about it, led to what he'd written in his 1904 memorandum about the evils of slavery and imperialism. Because I think both of those were key areas which Joseph Rowntree in particular, but I think all the Rowntree family were very concerned about, including, I think, John Wilhelm. But John Wilhelm was a young modernizer. It was he who had persuaded his father of the benefits of advertising. Joseph Rowntree, when he started the business, didn't want to do any advertising, and it was John Wilhelm Rowntree who actually persuaded him that they needed to advertise to sell the products, and he won the argument. He won the argument on the advertising, and he won the arguments about the plantations in the West Indies. And that's largely because I think his father had such a high regard for him as well. Now, John Wilhelm was not only interested in modernizing the business, he played a really leading role in modernizing Quakerism. He was seen as a visionary within the Quaker society, promoting a more open, liberal outlook, embracing science, engaging with social issues, and moving away from the evangelical, Bible-based fundamentalism which had gripped the Society of Friends in the 19th century and other nonconformist churches too. And he was the leading figure, John Wilhelm, at the age of 27 behind the 1895 Manchester Conference, which was deemed a major turning point in British Quakerism. So he was this youngish man in his late 20s, trying to make a difference and really wanting to modernize both the business and Quakerism and all sorts of other things as well. But he was also a progressive politically and a champion of many of the causes dear to the heart of the Quakers at the time. Like his father, he was deeply involved in the adult school movement in the city of York. And in fact, the adult school in Acomb, he set up basically on his own and ran the adult school there and was teaching there every Sunday for many, many years. He was also a supporter of the anti-slavery movement and the fight for racial justice. And I was really interested to read yesterday a quotation that he wrote actually on the same trip that he went to Trinidad in 1898, because he went on from Trinidad to the United States of America. And when he arrived in the port in New Orleans, he found that there were 3 waiting rooms on the port, one for ladies, one for gentlemen, and one for coloured people. And he wrote in his diary about that, "It is strange that I, an Englishman from a benighted country which still supports such a medieval institution as a monarchy, should find my first sentiment on the republican and free soil of the United States to be one of indignation at the insulting inequality and injustice to a coloured race who are yet on paper free and equal citizens with the whites." That's, I think, quite a radical statement from someone at that time. And yet, and I suppose that's where I'm feeling with all of this, and yet, because there is a big and yet, it was the same John Wilhelm Rowntree who was behind the purchase of the 6 estates in Dominica and the 4 estates in Jamaica. And most of these estates were former slave plantations. Now, it's interesting, you probably saw the figures that Laura had put out there. In 1904, there were 9 white managers, 343 black labourers, and 100 East Indian labourers in the Rowntree estates in the West Indies. The presence of the white workers was clearly a direct result of British colonialism. The presence of the black labourers on the estate was clearly a consequence of slavery, even though it had been abolished 70 years previously. And the presence of the East Indian workers was clearly a consequence of the system of indentured labour. So there is no evidence, and we have no evidence, and we've found no evidence, that the Rowntree Company used contracts of indenture on their Caribbean plantations. And my own personal feeling is that it's not likely that they ever did, because I think with a value base as what John Wilhelm was talking about in terms of that quote in his diary, I think that they wouldn't have tolerated contracts of indenture. But nevertheless, what is absolutely clear is that if they were not directly involved, they were indirectly benefiting from indentured labour and to some extent slavery in terms of their workforce in the West Indies. So we heard that in a way, the West Indian plantations was in the end deemed to be a failure. In fact, it's interesting that by 1902, which was only 4 years after they'd bought the first of the plantations, they had made a decision that they weren't going to invest a great deal more money in them. And we know that most of the estates never made a profit, and the hurricanes had played havoc with the crops, and the greater significance probably was the British government limiting the import of cocoa during the First World War. Those were the reasons that Laura there identified there. But another reason was that the champion of the West Indian initiative within the Rowntree Company sadly, very sadly, died in 1905. That's John Wilhelm Rowntree at the age of 37. And thereafter, the company took a far more cautious approach. Now, clearly, John Wilhelm Rowntree was living in a different era to us. But the sense of that contradictions between his writings and views on social justice in the UK, and the absence of any deep analysis of the consequences of the demand for cocoa on those producing the raw materials, to our eyes, seems, I think, remarkable, that there was no real connection. And I think this is so much where what Maureen was talking about was the impact of this over the long term becomes really, really important. Yeah, and I suppose I just wanted to end by kind of saying that reading about this and thinking about this has made me really think about the issue of social problems, social injustices, which are hidden in full sight. Because until I got involved in this, for me, John Wilhelm Rowntree, and I think to most Quakers, is something of a hero. He's someone who really took on the conservatism of 19th century Quakerism and changed it quite radically, and has been deemed as being the real influence behind that. So here was someone who had that, he was and was wanting to modernize in all sorts of other ways, and yet it seems that there was a blind spot in terms of not really thinking or wanting to think about the consequences of where the products that the Rowntree business here in York was based on, where they came from, or what impact in the long term that had. And I was really thinking about this last year because we had visiting York from North India, a human rights defender who was at the University of York at the Centre for Applied Human Rights. And he's a lawyer working on labour rights in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I think he would say to me, if you have a blind spot of having something hidden in plain sight, think about the clothes that you're wearing. You know, and for me, that's the best comparator that I can think of, because when I put on my shirt, I often see made in Bangladesh or whatever. And he would be arguing that there's no fair contracts for the textile workers in Asia. And so we're still involved in all the points that I think Maureen was raising about where the colonial past. Now, I think it's incredibly complex, this. It's very complex, and I don't think we can simplify it. But this part of the story of the Rowntrees, and we've talked about this time the Caribbean plantations, I think when we move on to where the majority of the cocoa did come from, which was actually West Africa, and the story of Sao Tome and Principe, and the cocoa scandal of 1901 to 1909, which was more or less at the same time as this, the story gets even more concerning, because it actually is about labour, which was definitely under slave labour, being used to purchase, to produce the cocoa, which all of the European chocolate companies were purchasing, but they purchased it on the market. And it's really interesting that in Anne Vernon's book on Joseph Rowntree, a Quaker businessman, she talks about Sao Tome very briefly, but she says the Rowntrees weren't involved in this, and yet they were fully involved in this issue. But it was just that they were purchasing the cocoa on the markets, and therefore, even though it came from Sao Tome and was being produced by slave labour, it wasn't so obvious. So I just think that we need to work on this and to have a much deeper understanding and thoughtfulness about this issue, and to keep that in balance with the positive stories of Rowntree, which I think we're all familiar with. And I think that's particularly important for us at this time, because we are, of course, moving into the anniversary year of Joseph Rowntree's death next year, and we in the Rowntree Society will want to be involved in thinking about that. It was a huge occasion, his funeral in York, and it meant a lot to an awful lot of people, and we'll be wanting to celebrate his life. But we also need to think about the the totality of this story, and also I think about so many of the issues that Maureen was raising about what impact that's had for the rest of our, how we've developed since those times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. We've just got a little bit of time for some Q&As of either myself or both Stephen and Maureen. I go over here.
May I just make a point? You said about the plantations finishing in the West Indies. You're interested in those about which a sugar buyer for Rowntree, and he was making voyages from England to the West Indies about 1920 by cocoa, still in the West Indies. So whoever was running plantations there, Rowntree was still buying it.
So what you're saying is that in the 1920s, even though the Rowntrees didn't have plantations in the West Indies, that was still a place that they were buying raw materials from. Can I go right to the back there?
Yeah, the presentations were all very interesting and I think very timely. I think for most people in this country, if they think about transatlantic slave trade at all, they probably think slavery was dealt with, done and dusted in 1834 with the passage of the second Slavery Act in Parliament and the payment of compensation to those who were losing their property. The state chose to describe it, i.e. the slaves that worked for them. The interest on those payments, by the way, some people may know this, but it was only paid off 9 years ago. So that's been part of where our taxes have been going for whatever it is, almost 200 years. What it does, though, I think, is raise the issue of reparations. And that's why I say it's a very timely discussion, because people will have noticed that the issue has surfaced again quite strongly with the Commonwealth heads of government meeting in Samoa, and the refusal of the Prime Minister to make a public apology. Now, I know the 3 Rowntree trusts have issued a written apology for the part that the Rowntree businesses played with slavery, but I thought what was interesting about both Laura and Maureen's presentations were that they gave us a very fine-grained illustration of what the impacts of slavery were, and that it wasn't just a question of a one-off payment of £20 million at the time, but the lasting impacts, both in terms of the continuing exploitation of the workers, low wages, the export of capital, the living conditions and all the rest of it, but the long-term impacts leading up to persistent racism in this country. Now, as I say, the 3 Rowntree trusts have issued a written apology, but I think one of the areas that the Rowntree Society might explore now would be what would be an appropriate form of reparation for the Rowntree businesses, the Rowntree Trust, to make, given the evidence which they're very carefully accumulating, which is very, very welcome, because I think that's a debate which needs to be had. I don't think an apology, written or whatever, is adequate. I think it's the first stage, and I think that's been recognised now globally, and I think Keir Starmer will probably recognise that the debate is on the table now and you can't avoid it. Something has to be done about reparations. The question is what form it takes. And I think that applies to the Rowntree Trust and the Rowntree Company as much as it does to the British government.
Do you want to take that one?
Yes. I think the issue of I think the issue of reparations is interesting, particularly the way the debate about it is going at this time. And I mean, I can't comment on what the Rowntrees would do in terms of reparation, but on a general note, I think they, in a sense, the whole narrative around it is being, I suppose, hijacked from the real subject, because what you hear in the media is about money and money going to individuals and so much money and, you know, and in actual fact, no, I don't hear any country talking about giving money to its citizens as a means of reparation. So I think that's a narrative that is deliberately being formed to, you know, to actually move away from the real issue. And I think you're right in terms of it addressing some of the, I mean, even if it just stopped all the systems that creates the inequalities, that would be a good starting point. That alone would be a good starting point, because what those systems do is actually prevent countries from developing. And if countries have the means to develop themselves, then I think that would be a perfectly good start. And we don't even have to be starting but talking about compensating individual people, because that's not what reparation is about. And I think the media in this country is deliberately hijacking the narrative about that. Do you want to say anything?
Is there any more questions right at the back over here?
Thank you very much, all of you. And it is fascinating seeing how this is all emerging. I'm very interested in whether you think it's going to be possible to hear the voices and the stories and hear about the names of the Black and East Indian Samoan workers. Because obviously what you've been doing today is talk about the family. That is part of it, the conversation. But I'm bothered that in what's to come, it's easy to privilege the stories of the people who are written about, and how might you go about finding out? As I say, even the names of people who worked there or who have stories, or descendants of who have stories to tell.
Yeah, so you're asking about how we get the stories of the Black and the East Indian people that were working there and know more about them. It is some work that we'd be interested in doing. We've been thinking about how we could do that. There is it would involve a kind of international research project. We are actively looking for people to collaborate on this kind of work, and it's something that as the Rowntree Society we recognise ourselves that what we're getting is the story from particularly the Rowntrees, particularly based in York, and a lot of that is partly who we are with the Rowntree Society, but also a lot of our evidence comes from the Rowntree archives that's in York. And so it's about looking at other archives, whether that's in the Caribbean or whether there are oral histories. There was a researcher, I think was it Emma Robertson, who went out to, was it Nigeria or West Africa, who got oral histories about people who'd been involved in cocoa farms that had supplied the Rowntrees, and so that's in one of her books, and you can find details of that on our website and stuff as well. So any more either of you want to add?
Just a little bit. Right, I'm Guyanese, and there was a lot of indentured labor that went to Guyana, and the country is roughly 48% of people from African descent who would have been enslaved people, and about 51% or thereabouts from Indian indentured labor. And while I can't say, I'm sure what I'm trying to say is that I'm sure there's sort of is historical voices talking about how they've developed up to this point. But it will take research to do that. But, growing up, I can't, there's kind of things, that is just being part of that society and seeing all the divisions and the political divisions, the political fallout from that as well. And that still goes on today. So, I'm sure there'll be voices there that could tell a story.
Thank you. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you again to Maureen and Stephen for your contributions, and also Laura for the presentation. And thank you all for coming tonight. And I hope that you've found this evening informative and thought-provoking, and that we've added to your knowledge of the Rowntree story, and by extension, York and the world's history. Going forward, as I said earlier, we're looking to work with collaborators on our Colonial Histories and Legacies project. So please get in touch if there's something you'd be interested in, or you've got contacts or ideas. And the best way to do that is to email info@rowntreesociety.org.uk. You can see up here we've got some other website and social media stuff, so you can get in touch there. The QR code that we've got up there takes you to our link tree, where you can find all of our online content, including a link to our local giving page, where you can make donations to support the Rowntree Society in order to continue our work. If you are interested in doing this, it can just be a one-off donation, or some people choose to give regular monthly donations, which we're thankful for too. You can also sign up to our newsletter via our website or the QR code, and that's where you can keep up to date with all our news. And as Stephen mentioned earlier, next year is going to be a big year for us, because it marks the centenary of Joseph Rowntree's death, and so we're currently in the middle of planning a whole programme for that. Thank you.